Hello, welcome to another edition of At Home with the Roosevelts. I'm Paul Sparrow, the director of the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. And today we're going to have an opportunity to talk with a great scholar and author and historian and one of the country's experts on Franklin Roosevelt, Harvey Kaye. Harvey, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I can only tell you it would be even better if I were truly at home with the Roosevelts in the library, in the home. One of my favorite places, as I think you know already.
Well, you spent a lot of time here. What is this? This latest book of yours, is this your 16th book, your 15th book, 16th book?
Well, authored and edited, this is going to be I think it's 18, but
18.
But who's counting, right? Who's counting?
Well, I was trying to count, but obviously I didn't do a very good job of it. And we're going to talk about a number of things. That your most recent book, obviously, we're going to start with. But first, I'd like you to share with our audience your perspective of who Franklin Roosevelt really was and what does he represent in American history.
Okay, well, first of all, I'll say the obvious. There are two truly great presidents in American history. One is Abraham Lincoln, and one is Franklin Roosevelt. And the big question, this is what I think is really at stake with Roosevelt and our memory of him, is that when you ask people what made, say, Washington and Lincoln and FDR, I say Washington because his greatness was as a leader generally even before the time of the United States as a constitutional republic. You know, what makes these three men so great? You could refer to Rexford Tugwell's remark, which I promise you I will get to the library to give a talk on. And that was, we are a lucky people. You know, whenever the nation itself has been at stake, we've had phenomenal leaders. And he mentions Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And I think if you ask people why they were three great or the greatest, they'll tell you something about, well, it had something to do with war. And there is undeniably an element of that. But I think what really makes the three of them great, and this is really a standout of Lincoln and Roosevelt, is that in the midst of mortal crises, okay, the creation of the nation with Washington, the sustaining of the nation with Lincoln, and the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, the Great Depression with FDR, and then the war against fascism, which by no means were we guaranteed to win. And if you follow, the trajectory through the 30s to the time of the war, just imagine if FDR had not won the presidency, both in 32 and 36, and prepared America, if not for the war, for the greatness that it would experience. So here's the thing, mortal crises, and how did we transcend those crises? Lincoln and FDR basically empowered Americans. And in doing so, and both of them made these kinds of remarks, what they did is that they made America freer, more equal, and more democratic as the means to which or by which we would transcend those crises. And I think in the case, if you think about what's truly phenomenal about FDR, is that historians always say, well, he saved capitalism. No, he may well have done that, but he saved, as the leader of a democratic people, saved democracy by making it all the more democratic. And that's the kind of thing that just really struck me when I began my first book on FDR, really, The Fight for the Four Freedoms. And when I went back to do this, I really was reminded, I don't know if you can see it, these are, my collections of FDR speeches up here. They're all online, of course, now, but these stand right by me. The democratic spirit that FDR exuded was not only a model to the American people themselves, it should be a model to us. I'll stop at that for now, okay?
Well, and I agree totally. And I think that idea of how do you release the greatness in the American system and in the American people is one of the things that is most at risk right now, as we see a loss of confidence, a loss of faith in our democratic systems. Now, one of the great challenges of studying Roosevelt is that he never got to write his own book. He never got to write his own story. So the only way to really understand him is to look at the words that he did write and that he spoke during his period as governor and president of the United States. Your most recent book, which is fantastic, is that FDR on Democracy: The Greatest Speeches and Writings of President Franklin Roosevelt, which you can see right there, behind you. It's you've taken an array of his speeches and you've tried to contextualize them. We can't obviously go through all of them. There's a couple of speeches I would like to ask you specifically about. But for you, is there one speech that you feel really reveals him in a way that the other speeches don't?
Well, sorry, I could never choose just one because my favorite speech in many ways is the speech that sort of propelled me to write my first book, and that is the Four Freedoms speech. I think that's one of the most inspired and inspiring speeches that any president has ever given. But having said that, what you can say about Franklin Roosevelt is that his acceptance speech of 1936 at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, before a crowd of 100,000 people, it is probably the most radical speech ever given by an American president. For in that speech, it's where he talks about the state of America and the crisis that still prevails, as if it's a return to the crisis of the revolution itself. And he says, in the revolution, we fought the political royalists. Here today, we're fighting the economic royalists. And there's that great line in the speech. And no president has ever said a line this radical, other than perhaps Lincoln, and I can talk about that another time. There was a line in 1862, but this speech, he says, these economic royalists complain that we're seeking to overturn American institutions, overthrow American institutions. And what he says in short is, look, we're not looking to overturn American institutions. We're looking to overthrow their power. And I think when I came across that the first time, I thought, oh my goodness, could you imagine an American president other than Roosevelt? Maybe Lincoln, for sure, because of the battle against the slaveholders. But that to me is great. And then finally, a speech which I think really, it's returned in these last few years into American political life, is that State of the Union address of 1944, in which, after much discussion of the challenges that continue to present themselves in the war effort, he turns to the American people and he's basically in the Congress, and he says, we have come to recognize that needy men, necessitous men, are not free men. And he lays out an economic bill of rights, which he then says, we must be careful about those who would never, ever accept this idea. Not to go into it in detail, but what we find, and I didn't even mention the Commonwealth Club speech of 1932 in September, October 1932, in which he first calls for an economic declaration of rights. So I cheated on you, Paul, sorry. The Economic Declaration of Rights of 32, the great acceptance speech of the nomination in 36, the Four Freedoms speech, which stands above them all in certain fashion, and then that Economic Bill of Rights speech. That weren't my speeches, they were FDR's, but that was like having to choose among your children. I'm sorry.
Well, I totally understand that when you start really reading through his work, it's extraordinary the kinds of things he says. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in the 1936 convention speech, isn't that where he also says, my opponents hate me and I welcome their hatred, right?
Well, that I can't remember if it's there or in the Madison Square Garden speech in October of that year. But it's also the speech, and he will forever be remembered. I mean, Ronald Reagan, who loved to hijack history and did a remarkable job of doing it, he actually grabs hold of that speech itself. Why? To grab hold of the line, "This generation has a rendezvous with destiny." I want to, people always say to me, well, didn't he have speech writers? Wasn't he the president who sort of created the whole speech writing team? And I say, yeah, but you know what? Over and over again, the speech writers themselves acknowledged the finest lines, the perorations, emanate from Roosevelt himself.
Yeah, and we have the drafts that show those various iterations of those speeches. And Judge Rosenman wrote a terrific book about his experience as a speechwriter, and they would describe these torturous processes where they would write these drafts, and he would come in and Roosevelt would immediately go to the weakest part of the whole speech and say, this needs to be fixed, and he would throw a line out, and they'd all look.
By the way, that one is sitting right there behind my book.
Great book. So you've also written several books about Thomas Paine,
Yeah.
who was the great radical during the American Revolution. There are components of FDR's speeches which really harken back to Thomas Paine.
Yes, I can tell you, in fact, that the reason I got the idea back in the early, what was it, like 2005, 6, after my book Thomas Paine, The Promise of America was finished, is that my major book on Paine is really retelling the American story through Thomas Paine's legacy. And I just was amazed. I had somehow forgotten this speech from earlier days as a student. There's the speech that Roosevelt gives in February, Washington's birthday weekend in 1942. And in this speech, he actually opens the speech. This is, of course, in the wake of Pearl Harbor. Americans are getting whipped in wherever they are in the world, basically. And he's going to tell them the imperative. They need to have maps available. He's going to tell them the imperative of fighting a two-front war and how it is that we can accomplish that with our allies. And he opens with Washington's retreat from New York and then Fort Lee, New Jersey, across the Delaware. And he sort of leaves us in this really terrible moment where, as we know, Washington himself was convinced that if the British struck him again, it was all over. And then he goes and he talks about the American soldiers and sailors and Marines who were overseas resisting at that moment, and how we need to then provide for them and rally ourselves by way of the draft and the war effort. And after all of this, having mentioned the four freedoms along the way and so on, he comes to the end and he returns to Washington's position along the Delaware in 1776 in December. And he tells people how, Washington has his officers read these words to his troops, and it's Paine's words from the crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. And in short, what Roosevelt is saying is, Paine spoke for us then, and he speaks for us today. Roosevelt's embrace of Thomas Paine at that moment is what led me to consider, what do I want to write about Roosevelt? I mean, I grew up in a family. My father was a greatest generation veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. My mom had done stuff in the war effort. I'd grown up with an affection for Roosevelt. But that was the moment where I came to realize that I really needed to look into Roosevelt. And in doing so, I discovered, first of all, that Eleanor Roosevelt, in her book, The Moral Basis of Democracy, which I also have nearby here, she actually devotes more pages to talking about Thomas Paine in that book than any other figure. And so what you find is that this connection, well, Roosevelt was the history teacher in chief, and he seemed to know where to grab hold of the past in order to remind Americans of who they were. Did that sort of get at your question?
Absolutely. And there's three different types of Roosevelt speeches. By the way, the February 42 speech with the maps is one of my favorites of his.
Yes, well, absolutely. So, by the way, the New York Times thought it might have been his best when they reviewed it.
So there are three types of FDR speeches. There are campaign speeches. There are policy speeches in which he's out, either talking about Congress or out in the public. And then there are the fireside chats.
Right.
Fireside chats are really quite remarkable in the history of presidential oratory because they change the dynamic between a sitting president and the American public. And he had sort of perfected this technique when he was governor of New York. But to me, the most important of his fireside chats was the first one, which he gives in March, just a few days after his inauguration. His first official act as president of the United States was to close every bank in America. He called it a bank holiday,
right,
to stop the banking crisis. Banks had been failing all across the country. It was really, there was a real question of whether democracy would survive. And in this speech, he's talking about the next day, they're going to be reopening the banks in the 12 Federal Reserve cities. And he starts off by saying, I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the banking crisis. And as the comedian Will Rogers later said, he explained the banking crisis so well to the American public that even the bankers understood what had happened. But I want you to talk about that speech a little bit, because this is...
Can I beg off? You know what? That's the one speech I have to tell you that's the speech I have least examined. Isn't that funny? that you went there. I mean, and you've done a really nice job of that, of presenting it and its importance. I can only speak to the fact that he had warned Americans in his in his inaugural address of what he was likely to do to the banks when he basically says the money changers have left the temple, kind of thing. But I'm not really on top of that speech, I have to confess.
Well, the power of that speech was that, at the end of the week, after he'd said, here's what we're doing about the banking crisis, and when they reopened the banks, instead of people rushing to the banks to get their money out, millions of dollars flowed back into the banking system. He basically ended the banking crisis,
right,
simply through his, even
right.
though none of the economic conditions had changed. His confidence in the American people, his confidence in the system was enough to move the crisis off the front page, which is very similar to what he did in the February 42 speech you're talking about, where the world seems to be on fire, but his confidence, his long-term vision of what America's going to be really takes forward. Let's jump to the subject of your previous book, which is the Four Freedoms speech, because I think we can all agree that there's a component of that speech which is one of the most remarkable moments in American history. And it really, in many ways, defines America's rise to the global superpower. Yeah. And it's actually two speeches. The first half is sort of a fairly straightforward State of the Union address. And then about 3 minutes before the end, it's like he throws a switch and it becomes a totally different speech. Talk about.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, I will tell you, I mean, it was great, by the way, to be in the library when I was first, I'll never forget that day that I went to the library for that purpose. It was not my very first time in the library. Actually, I think I had gone to the library any number of times as a kid, but I think it was the first time was during the Thomas Paine stuff. But this was the day in which I was really embracing FDR, and I think I may have told you in private our meetings. I always had this feeling when I was holding those papers for the 7 drafts that maybe somebody had not somehow rubbed away FDR's DNA, and I could just somehow connect with it. And also, I just remember walking out of the library that day, that first time doing the research after the morning part of the day. And I couldn't help but go to I think I actually had a cell phone at that time. And I think I couldn't help but call my wife and friends and say, God, you're not going to believe what I was just doing, which I know is rather odd for a then middle-aged historian, but I guess couldn't. Oh, anyhow, that speech from for the Four Freedoms, it was really, what makes it remarkable is that indeed, it is a State of the Union address. And at the outset, there's no signal. We don't realize what we're going to eventually hear. But it is important, that first part of the speech, because let's not forget, Americans were not cowards, but neither were they eager to go to war. Okay, as a historian whose name I'm forgetting once said, when in American history would Americans have gone to vote in favor of going to war? That kind of thing, okay? So, but we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which they were prepared to deny a victory to Hitler or to the Emperor of Japan. That's crucial. But he opens up and he warns Americans. This is in the wake, by the way, of that late December Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat, in which he's basically telling Americans that it is imperative to turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy. So they already have a sense of what they might hear. And when he goes before the nation, that on this occasion for the State of the Union, what he does is he tells Americans what must strike them as, oh yeah, of course. And he says, they will not tell us when they will strike. In other words, they're not going to call us up and say, or telegraph and say, hey, we're about to attack you. He says, so we need to be prepared. And he returns to the arsenal of democracy idea, and also to the degree to which Americans themselves must become a nation of defense industries. And there is already a draft. It's clear he's going to expand upon the draft. But here's what's interesting. He knows what is concerning Americans. He knows that they've come through 8 years of battling a depression and pursuing the labors of the New Deal and empowering themselves in labor unions and women's movements and the beginnings really of an energetic civil rights movement. And he says to them that really, if we're going to be prepared, we don't give up on the New Deal. What we've been doing in the New Deal is all the more imperative. because he realizes the degree to which we have to be in good health, we have to be in good standing, we have to be educated, we have to be smart. And then he lays out the imperative of continuing to pursue the essentials of the New Deal. And then he stops, right? And this is a message to the world in many ways. And by the way, all one has to do is Google 4 freedoms in Canada or Britain, and you know the degree to which it did resonate overseas. And he says, you know, basically, we have to look forward to a world beyond the war. Now, at this moment, and when I read those words, I hear FDR grabbing hold of the spirit of Paine, of the words of the Declaration, the words of the Bill of Rights, the words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This is a speech that ranks alongside those in its importance of reminding Americans of the American promise and of what America must represent to the world. And it says, of course, that we must envision, basically saying we must pursue a world beyond this war. We're not even in it yet. 4 freedoms, right? 4 fundamental human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship or freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And as many people said, the first 2 freedoms were already embodied in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. The next 2 freedoms are implied by the American story, and they have been basically fundamental to the energies of the New Deal. He's now projecting it as a message to America and to the world. And you know, this response was interesting. Eleanor Roosevelt and the New York Post, then liberal New York Post columnist Samuel Grafton remarked that the response was tremendous. However, the response from the Republicans was rather subdued. I think one of them said they're sitting on their hands. And the response at a certain moment from the Southern Democrats was rather subdued. Perhaps the idea of freedom from want and freedom from fear for all was not exactly along the lines they had in mind in the white supremacist South. But it's a really remarkable speech. And I can tell you that if anybody gets to the library, don't fail to pick up one of these, okay? It's just, keep that nearby, because that should inspire your thinking.
Well, the part of that speech that was really revolutionary and that his advisors argued with him about was at the end of each, as he articulated freedom from want, freedom from fear, he said everywhere in the world.
Yes.
All 4 times, like a preacher, he just repeated it, you know, everywhere in the world, because he wasn't just speaking to Americans during that State of the Union address. He was speaking to the world, and the world was looking to America and looking specifically to Franklin Roosevelt for some salvation. And by insisting that these weren't American ideals, these were global ideals. I think that's what really radicalized, his supporters and made them realize that this war we're going to fight, there's a moral imperative here. This wasn't for territory. This wasn't to preserve the British Empire. This was about the freedom of all people going forward in the world. And that's what makes that speech so remarkable.
Yeah, and as you know, and I've argued with people that perhaps in public, that I think you've been present when I've argued, a lot of historians tend to say, well, you know, he gave the speech, it didn't resonate, it didn't have the impact. People just didn't pay, historians just, I don't know if they're cynical about it or, you know, about in the world in which we live today, but it really was the case that Americans did actually embrace it. They were never perhaps capable of reciting them. But as somebody in that time said, they couldn't even tell you what the 4 liberties of the First Amendment were, but they somehow they imbibed it. It becomes a part of every American's thinking, the First Amendment, even if they can't recite them. Similarly, the 4 freedoms became a part of every American's thinking in the course of that war. And they projected, if not for the world, they may have had reservations about realizing it for the world, but Americans did embrace the idea and the ideals.
Well, our time is running up, but I want to talk a little bit about the Jefferson Day speech that FDR didn't deliver, the one he wrote in Warm Springs. He'd done an annual Jefferson Day speech, and he wrote this, but of course he died on the day before the speech was supposed to be delivered. And the last line of the speech, I think, and you can talk about this, this idea is repeated throughout his speeches. He says, the only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith. This really sort of sums up his whole philosophy, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. You know, one of the things that was really remarkable is, and even for those of us who might have serious doubts about the existence of God, he had a tremendous faith in God. He had a tremendous faith in the American people, and I think those faiths gave him a really phenomenal sense that he was capable of doing things despite the fact, despite the fact that he was in a wheelchair. And the other thing is that, you know, when I think back from the very beginning, he's always looking to develop his philosophy. I mean, people will find the very first speech, you know the one I'm talking about, Paul, which he gave back in 1912 to the People's Forum, in which he's searching for a way to advance the American promise. And he's doing a little bit of a dance between, you know, socialism and progressivism, but he coins the expression liberty of the community. And you can see this struggle is taking place. Later, over and over again, you can see the way he's sort of trying to find his way through and do so in a way that brings people with him. There's a great speech in 1926 that he gave up at Milton Academy to teenagers. And in this speech, he says he's not worried. He says, look, it may well be the usual thing for conservatives to govern America. I don't worry about that. What I worry about is that for too long, conservatism, for people who are hostile to the idea of progressive change, that for too long they will govern, that is destructive. So in essence, as president, he's bringing forward this sense of, yes, I hate to quote Barack Obama at this moment, but yes, we can. And he really does exude that kind of spirit. And the other thing is that he believed in 1920, and he continues all the way through to the day of his death to believe in the imperative of international cooperation. And he believes fully that Americans can be the leaders in making that happen. And that final speech, yeah, I think it is the summation of his philosophy, that faith, again, in God, his faith in America and its people, and his faith perhaps that what he's begun as president with and by the way, everything he did as president was empowered by the American people themselves. In fact, he once said, I don't want to get too far out ahead of my fellow citizens. He said that to a journalist in 1932. And over again, what we find is that he invites them to push him because he has faith they will push him in the right direction.
Well, Harvey, I want to thank you. And I can tell you that I read the FDR speeches book during the height of the pandemic here in New York and during the run up to the election. It was a dark time. Things seemed just so overwhelming. And yet your book was really uplifting. It was inspiring. It made me feel, you know, like no matter what we face as Americans, we can overcome them and go back to try to build a more perfect union. So thank you. Your book really was inspirational and it helped me through a dark period, and I hope everyone reads it. And I just want to thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Oh, no, thank you. This is such a pleasure. And it's great to see you again, Paul. It made my day. Thank you.
And I could talk to you for hours, and hopefully we'll get you back to the library once we reopen and do a live program.
Let's hope the vaccine appears very soon.
Yes. Okay. Thank you all for joining us at another At Home with the Roosevelts. I hope to see you soon.